Bienvenidos todos a esta segunda charla. Welcome, Francesco. Thank you very much for accepting the offer. And, bueno, la mayoría habla español, entonces mejor lo dejamos en español. La presentación va a ser en inglés porque ya está todo, pero siéntanse en la libertad de preguntar si pueden, si tienen alguna duda. Bienvenido a la Universidad Anáhuac. Estamos muy orgullosos de presentar esta serie de conferencias, charlas y sobre todo diálogos intergeneracionales sobre el retiro. Necesitamos que los chavos de ahora, los futuros actuarios, escuchen bien toda esta parte de cómo se ha planeado, cómo ha evolucionado la parte del retiro a nivel mundial y para que tengan, ahora sí que tengan herramientas para hacer propuestas nuevas. Entonces, la experiencia que tienen ustedes es maravillosa. Gracias por estar aquí. Gracias por compartirnos todo su conocimiento. Bienvenido.
Well, Francesco Briganti is the Secretary General of the Cross-Border Benefits Alliance, Europe, which is an EU advocacy association based in the European quarters in Brussels. This association promotes the creation of cross-border and European social benefit solutions, including occupational, workplace, and personal pensions, vis-à-vis the EU and the national decision makers. Francesco is also the CEO of the Employee Benefits and Welfare Institute, a Belgian public affairs company. As an expert, he has been for several years a member of the European Commission's Pension Forum and was a member of the EU working group aimed at drafting a code of good practices for pension funds. Francesco, Dr. Briganti, has been speaker at more than 300 conferences all over the world and is often quoted by the main European media of this sector. Finally, Francesco is currently giving lectures at several universities throughout Europe and provides its expertise to governments on social protection matters. He has made presentations even at the White House. And if you may allow me to add a personal note, when I was Director of Social Protection at the ILO, we received invitations to participate in the World Pension Forum that was taking place in the Netherlands every year. And we were not convinced that we should participate or not, because that was not a United Nations meeting. But anyway, I attended the meeting and I heard many conferences, but there was one particular conference that really caught my eye and my attention, and that was Francesco Briganti's presentation. I think it's going to be very close to what he will present to us today. And I was really impressed about how very complex solutions that happen in different countries in Europe, he is able to explain the diversity and the objectives of all of them. And then since then, I have been a follower of Francesco, and I would invite you to follow him through the social media. If you follow him, you will find that one week he's in the American-Italian Association in Washington, and the next he is in another continent. He's a true expert and a true activist on pensions. So we are really delighted to have you with us, Francesco. So please, the floor is yours, and kindly share your presentation.
Gracias. Gracias a Lourdes, gracias a Alejandro, gracias a todo el mundo. Como Lourdes lo ha dicho, haré la presentación en inglés. La verdad que será una presentación que explicará sobre todo la diferente clasificación que tenemos en Europa de los pilares. Se dice pilares en inglés, en español, creo, ¿no? Pilares,
sí,
pilares de las pensiones, bastante complicada, en verdad. Luego lo veremos. Efectivamente, la Unión Europea es una unión económica, también ahora más política, pero todavía los sistemas de jubilación se quedan nacionales. Entonces los Estados miembros pueden quedarse con su sistema propio, y es por eso que la diferencia es muy grande entre países. Good.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we start with this presentation, which is, like I said before, it is about the difficult distribution, the classification, I would say, of the pension systems in Europe, especially the so-called pillars. And it's very important to make a kind of previous preliminary remark, which is that basically our pension systems in Europe are still very different and very diversified, because when the European Union was created, pensions was not really a big discussion. Actually, there was discussion. It was at the very beginning, the 50s, but it was very brief. And the idea was either to harmonize the social security systems of the, at that time, 6 founders members of the European Union, or to keep them different and independent. And that was the final decision. So the only, let's say, preoccupation from the member states was then to coordinate them in order to promote the mobility of workers in the European Union, because you can imagine that in terms of accrual and safeguard of pension rights, it was important that, say, an Italian migrant in the 50s who was moving to work to Germany had the possibility to keep accruing his pension rights in order then to get these pension benefits at the end of his or her career. And so the idea was the coordination of the social national social security systems. And the formula was Smith abroad, so basically free market abroad, Keynes at home. And so social instead policies were still national. And you can imagine that we are in a situation where now there are 27 member states in the European Union. We had the 28, but you know, Brexit. So now there are 27 member states with 27 different national pension systems. Now, the thing is that in order to classify our pension pillars in the European Union, we cannot really make a classification from a European perspective. The only thing we can do is to understand under which European legislation are subject. And that's basically the only way how we are able to classify a first or second or a third pillar. Now, I don't know I think I know, but I mean, of course, I'm not sure that I know that it's the same like in Europe, but excuse me, like in Latin America, Mexico, in your case, in other Latin American countries. But here in Europe, we commonly consider the first pillar as the pillar which is managed by the state, normally is mandatory by law. It works, that's the most important thing. It works on a pay-as-you-go system, which means that the current workers are paying immediately pensions to the retirees. Reparto, I think you say in Spanish. And this system is traditionally defined benefit, even if in some countries, like for example in Sweden, or even in my country, Italy, it is now a defined contribution system, but still pay as you go. Then the second pillar for us is based on the corporate. So you work for a company, and we call them occupational or workplace pensions, because the company pays contributions into a pension fund, and the worker sometimes pays, sometimes not. It depends on the local agreements. They are not always mandatory. Sometimes they are mandatory through collective agreements in particular, or they are voluntary. So companies can offer or not occupational pensions, second pillar, to their employees. We also call them employee benefits, in fact, because it's a part of the benefit of working for a company. And then instead of the third pillar is basically individual personal pensions. They are basically always defined contribution, and they are voluntary. So everyone can decide to buy, let's say, a pension product individually. Now, for the first pillar, like we said, it is let's say, until the 90s in Europe, it was quite easy. This difference was clear and it was easy. I would say in almost all the member states, considering that in the meantime, the European Union grew more and more, because like I said, in the 50s, there were only 6 founder members of the European Union, and now there are 27 countries. But I mean, let's say until the 90s, more or less, this classification was quite clear. First pillar, statutory, second, occupational, and third, individual. First pillar managed by the state. This is the most important thing. Occupational, managed by pension funds. Third pillar, usually managed by asset managers or insurance companies. I think this is more or less what I said, so I will not come back to this. But of course, after the 90s, we started to have some problems in the classification of our pillars in the European Union, because we discovered that some new countries joining the European Union had different pension systems, and so basically a different classification of those pillars. And so when we come back to the European legislation, I said before that the main worry when the European Union was created was then basically only to coordinate the social security systems, because occupational pensions and the third pillar pensions, so individual pensions, were very, very limited. If we come back to the 80s, Europeans were basically relying on the public pension system. And so, of course, the legislation was created in order to coordinate the social security systems. There were 3 different legislations, but we can remain with the last one, which is still the one in force. It's the European Regulation 8304, which coordinates the first pillar pensions. When we come to the, let's say, the 90s, the European Union starts also to deal with a common market for financial services. And so basically the European Union starts to make legislation on pension funds, on insurance companies, and on asset management products. And so here, of course, it was much more important for the European Union also to establish which pensions, of course not the statutory ones, were falling under those legislation about pension funds, insurance companies, or asset managers, management usage. There were many attempts to classify the pension systems by different international organizations. So we can mention the OECD, the ILO, the World Bank, Eurostat, and even the European legislation at the time tried to establish the scope of application of some directives. And so basically tried to make a classification of the different pillars in the pension pillars in the European Union. As an example, I think the most interesting was a communication from the European Commission in 1999, which was trying really to make a classification and description of the first pillar, second pillar, and third pillar. But this attempt was rejected by the member states, which said, no, our pension systems is our responsibility, our competence, and so we do not accept an harmonized classification on the different pillars of our pension systems. And so when we come back to this, let's say, legislation, everything which is under the coverage, so subject to the regulation 8304 for the social security systems, is considered first pillar. But then we will see that it doesn't mean that all the first pillar schemes are pay-as-you-go and are defined benefit. They can be different. All the legislation applying instead for pension funds and occupational pensions is to a second pillar, and instead the other directives about asset management, insurance directives, and so on, banking directives sometimes apply to individual pensions. So if we come back to this perspective, we have to say that a strict competence of the European internal market is about second and third pillar pensions. So all those pensions that normally are funded, they are funded, so they go in the, let's say, they invest in the financial markets with assets, they take some risks, you know, the financial markets. They are subject to the European competition rules, and you know that probably I don't know if you know, but I mean, in Europe, the competition rules are very important in order to avoid the protectionism, to open up a free market of the financial markets and so on. And there are even, especially for the insurance companies, some legislation about solvency and prudential rules, which is part of the competence not only of the European legislation, but also of the supervisory authority, which is called EIOPA. And this EIOPA is the supervisory authority on insurance companies and pension funds. By the way, it's also important to say that the internal market regulation on funded pensions, so second and third pillar, give also the possibility, allow the possibility, at least in principle, to create cross-border activities, which means that basically a pension fund based in one country, I don't know, say Belgium, can offer these services to company based in another European country, can be Germany, France, Italy, whatever. So there is, you know, really the spirit of having a large open internal market based also on competition and cross-border activities. Competition law, like I said, applies to these kind of funds and also the supervision. The problem is that the first pillar in the meantime was not as the one that we knew between the 50s and the 60s and 70s. Because in the meantime, when new member states joined the European Union, some member states, even within their first pillar, they gave the management, they granted the management of their first pillar pensions to different actors, different than the state, so private actors. And then there was also the possibility in some cases that even supplementary occupational pensions were managed by public entities or the other way around. There were different situations that we will see later on. So basically, even the first pillar was not anymore classified as in the past. And that's the picture that we can see here. We have roughly 5 cases where everything you see on the bottom, so the light blue and the gray, are considered as first pillars, but you can see that these first pillars can be very complicated. So they are not anymore in every European country a pay-as-you-go defined benefit and managed by the state. We have the case 1, we will see which country it is. We have the case 2, we will see, and so on. And we also see, which is quite important, that even the first pillar can see the case 1, but also in other countries, in other cases. You see that in parts of the first pillar is now funded, is not anymore only working on a pay-as-you-go basis, which is quite interesting, especially for the countries that are still relying on pay-as-you-go systems and do not even think to introduce funded parts in their first pillar. Now, again, how can we classify? Take, for example, the case number 2. the case number 2, you see the gray one. The gray one, the gray part, so a second level of the first pillar, it is funded. Considering that it is funded, it could be a pension fund, but because according to the, let's say, scope and choice of the member states, because it is still considered as a part of their first pillar, it is not subject to the European directives applicable instead to the second pillar. So it is basically the pension funds directive, the insurance directives cannot be applicable to this part, the gray part of the pension funds that for some member states are still considered part of their first pillar. And it can create some problems, but it is like this. So just to give you an example, the case 1 is Finland. We will see a little bit how it works. The case 2 is are basically Central and Eastern European countries, Slovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania. Then in other countries like Hungary and Poland, there was this system, but in part it was nationalized. So it came back under the management of the government. Then we have the examples of Sweden and Denmark. They are a little bit different, but I decided to put them under the same case 3. We have a case of France, which is still even more different. And then we have the case of Switzerland. Now, we have to immediately to say that Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. However, considering that it is a border country with all the other nations which are part of the European Union, Switzerland still applies this regulation about the coordination of the social security systems for the first pillar. And so for us, it is interesting because when Switzerland, which has an interesting pension system, is part of this determination where the European legislation can be applicable and where it is not applicable. Now, case 1, Switzerland, Finland. You saw here, it is the case 1. You see the case 1. In case 1, we have a mixed system. And here it is Finland. Finland, it is very interesting because Finland is a system where the first pillar, so we come back again to the gray part, and also on the bottom, the light blue part, there are basically 2 schemes which are part of the first pillar. According to the Finnish system, they are both part of the first pillar. There is a basic social security pension scheme, which is very limited, but then the great majority of Finnish contribute into a mixed system which is not managed by the state, but it is managed in outsourcing by private operators, non-for-profit, of course, they are non-for-profit, and they manage this money coming from the mandatory contributions of the Finnish population, both people, so workers and companies, and when they manage this money, 70%, more or less, it's mixed. 70% it works on a pay-as-you-go basis, so reparto, and 30% instead is funded. Now, the thing which is quite interesting is that, of course, this Finnish legislation establishes everything. So these companies do not have a real big room of maneuver. They cannot do whatever they want. They have to stay with what the Finnish legislation says, but they are in competition. So Finnish can decide to leave one company which is managing their pension system, and they decide to join another company. I think there are 6 in Finland that are doing this work. And there are no thresholds on the contributions, which means that companies and workers can decide to contribute even more money above the legal minimum requirements, And so basically, they don't need necessarily to join a real second pillar pension, because they can put the more money they want into their mixed first pillar. That's the reason why in Finland, the second pillar is quite limited. It is not because it is not in principle important, but it is just because Finnish workers and companies, especially workers, can decide to put how much money they want, even more than the minimum requirements required by law. Denmark and Sweden, which are together with Finland among the best, considered among the best systems, pension systems in the world, are also mixed. Because you can see that, again, we have a first level, let's say, of the first pillar, which is quite traditional, the light blue on the bottom. And then we have the gray part, which is a kind of second level, but according to the Swedish and Danish legislation, are still considered as their first pillar. We call them first pillar bis. It's a first pillar bis. It is, again, only regulated by the European legislation on the coordination on social security systems. So there are no European rules on solvency, on European supervision, on competition law, because it is still considered as a first pillar, mandatory. And we have, to be honest, there are some quite differences between Denmark and Sweden. But the point is that in Denmark, there is a pension fund, which is called ATP. It is one of the most performing and known pension funds in Europe, which is managed by representative of workers and employers, but it is basically owned by the state. So the state does not manage this pension fund, but it controls the pension fund. The management is up to employees and employers. It works on a defined contribution basis, and it is mandatory. All those people living in Denmark must pay not only to the social security system managed by the state, but also to this ATP pension fund. Okay. The case of Sweden is more interesting for some aspects, because part of the contributions, which is, it's called premium pension, if I'm not wrong, as far as I remember, I'm almost sure that it hasn't changed over the years. The premium pension is a part of the contribution that the Swedish people pay to their social security, and part of these contributions goes to some management, asset management companies, AP, they are called AP, they are in competition. There is AP1, AP2, AP3, AP4, if I'm not wrong. And this money is managed by these management companies, asset management companies, which are again part of the first pillar. So in Sweden, there is also an important second pillar. So basically, companies and workers can join the second pillar. Usually, the second pillar in Sweden is managed by insurance companies. So Sweden and also Denmark, by the way, apply especially when they have to the insurance directive, European insurance directives. But anyway, there is a funded part, which is part, like I said, of the first pillar. Again, a kind of second layer, a second part of the first pillar, okay? So second pillar is more on the top of this funded part, ATP for Denmark and premium pension for Sweden. And then we have a quite complicated case, which is the case of the countries from Central and Eastern Europe. Here, in the past, those countries had a real traditional European first pillar pay-as-you-go system. But in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, especially with the support of the World Bank, and you know what the World Bank is, because I think it's quite active in Latin America. The World Bank advised these countries to diversify the way to manage their first pillar pensions. And so basically the idea was to say, you cannot only rely on a pay-as-you-go system because the reparto is going to be a problem over the years, especially because of the aging of population and for many other reasons. So it's better that you diversify your first pillar mandatory again. Every time I say first pillar for us is mandatory, legally mandatory. You cannot escape from this. So the World Bank said, it's probably better that the part of these contributions remain in the pay-as-you-go, but another part can be paid to funded pensions, so managed by private operators, financial operators, which can make investments with this money. And the idea was good. The problem is that probably it was made in a way that it was too dramatic, too strong, because you can imagine that in a system of a pay-as-you-go, so a reparto, when you start to reduce the contributions to the pay-as-you-go, the system goes immediately in a deficit. Part of, especially from the it was possible from the employees. The employees had the opportunity, especially when they were younger, to not pay all their money to the pay-as-you-go, but they had this opportunity to pay their money to funded pensions managed by those financial operators. The result was that, especially because then we had also the huge crisis in 2000, financial crisis, 2007, 2008, you remember, there was a huge financial crisis. So the pension funds, which represented this kind of second layer of the first pillar in those countries, had very strong reductions of their assets. At the same time, the states were suffering a lot, the governments were suffering a lot, because a lot of money was not going anymore into the pay-as-you-go reparto system. And so they were in deficit. And so the result was in some countries, it happened particularly in Hungary, and then partially, but I would say strongly partially also in Poland, the governments decided to renationalize those pension funds, which are, again, according to this figure, the gray part of this chart. So we are not talking about the blue or the violet part. We are still talking about part of the first pillar. Now, considering that it was, according to the national perspective, it was still considered to be as part of their first pillar, even if it was funded and given in outsourcing. For those states, for those governments, it was quite easy to nationalize these pension systems. The European Union couldn't say you are doing you are, for example, violating the private property, because they were not considered as a part of the internal market. They were still considered as a part of the local national first pillar system. The case of France is a little bit, in my opinion, paradoxical, because in France, they have two first pillar pensions. The first, so the very first level, again, on the bottom, the light blue, it is the typical social security, sécurité sociale, like they say in France, typical pay-as-you-go system. And then the social partners, so basically employers and workers, made collective agreements establishing, they call them complementary schemes, complementary pension schemes, AGIRC and ARCO, you can see, ARCO for blue collars, AGIRC for people who have positions like executives, so let's say higher level in terms of salaries. And those, they are mandatory, they are managed by those social partners, employers and employees representatives. But that's the peculiarity of France. those are still working on a pay-as-you-go level reparto. So they have a reparto in the first, let's say, level of their first pillar, and they have a reparto also pay-as-you-go also in these complementary schemes, AGIRC and ARCO. Of course, everything which is on the top of this, so the blue part, second pillar, the real second pillar in France, is managed by insurers. It is let's say, chosen by some sectors that decide also to pay more money into pension systems, but they are managed by insurers and they are funded. But also France, the AGIRC ARCO schemes, not governed by the state, are coordinated as if they were part of the state. So they were basically, again, they are still, first pillar bis. And so they are not subject to competition rules of the European Union, supervision rules from the European Union, internal market rules of the European Union, because they are considered as national government systems. The last case, which is quite interesting and complicated again, it is Switzerland. Switzerland, it is interesting because Switzerland has a system where the first pillar, let's say, is still typically characteristical pay-as-you-go, but then in Switzerland, there is a second pillar which is in part mandatory for everyone, companies and employees, and it is managed by private entities, not for profit, but it's mandatory. And so until a certain level of contribution, this money is to be paid into, they call them foundations, pension foundations, working again on a funded basis. So they make investments. They are defined contribution, even if in Switzerland they give some guarantees, at least on the capitals, so on the contributions paid. Then the majority of Swiss citizens can pay into the same foundations more money on the top of the mandatory one. And this voluntary contribution, in addition of the mandatory ones, instead are considered as second level of their second pillar. So it's a game of wording, but it's a second level of second pillar. So a first level of second pillar funded is mandatory part of the Swiss system, in addition to the pay-as-you-go traditional first pillar. And then if workers and companies decide to pay more money, they can pay more money, and it is voluntary. Of course, the European Union, especially in the case of Switzerland, can only take care of coordinating the light blue first pillar and the gray part, because it is the second level for that, according to the European Union. So we called it first pillar bis. It is coordinated with the other social security systems in Europe. Switzerland does not instead apply the European directives on pension funds. So we are talking about the dark blue, does not apply the European directives on pension funds and insurance companies because it is not part of the European Union. So basically, to sum up a little bit, we can see that the first pillar schemes managed by private operators in a way or another are in several European countries. The black countries here work on a funded basis, first pillar, funded basis, part of them, of course, we said, part of them. France is the only one which has, yes, a second layer of the first pillar, but it is still working on reparto, pay-as-you-go, managed by the social partners, but private, of course, they are not the state. And then Finland is really mixed because within the same schemes, which are called TELA schemes, they are 70% pay-as-you-go, reparto, and 30% funded. So you can see that the classification is quite difficult because you cannot stay anymore with the traditional previous classification of the three pillars in the European Union. Now, the conclusions are quite clear. The classification of our systems, the pillars, is quite messy. The only way we can establish what it is first pillar in a European perspective or not is whether or not the coordination of social security systems is applied to those schemes. Every time it is not applied to those schemes, then it is not anymore considered as first pillar, but instead there are other there is other legislation applicable to them. And of course, we can also understand that it is a problem because the different treatment, if you take a pension fund that for a government is considered as a part of its first pillar, some legislation, especially in our case, the supervision prudential legislation, solvency legislation is not applicable to them because the state said, no, it's part of my social security part. So it's not second or third pillar. So European legislation cannot intervene. Of course, the European Union is trying and still trying, keeping to make a better supervision, and especially for the part which is under the directive on pension funds and so on. It is also trying, like I said, to create cross-border activities for pension funds. But probably the member states are very resistant. And I think, I don't know if in Latin America it is the same, but in every government in Europe easily can fall or win on the topics of pensions. So pensions is a very sensitive topic. And so basically member states try and keep resisting to keep their model as they are without and not accepting an intervention of the European Union, especially in the statutory first pillar pensions, even if we said that they are quite different. Now, what I can say is that there are for sure many pressures, especially on the funded pensions that are not under the European directives, that are trying many business pressures to try to open up a competition and to enter these markets which are protected. But for the moment, I would say that it is still very complicated. I remained in 50 minutes more or less, so I finish here. We have 10 minutes for questions or clarifications. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Francesco.
Fue complicado, lo siento, pero es
No,
así.
muy interesante. Muy interesante. Definitivamente, si me permiten agregar, definitivamente es necesario el segundo pilar, ya sea mandatorio o no, pero sí es necesario ese segundo pilar para poder fortalecer un poco las pensiones. Porque aquí en México tenemos muy poquito, entonces es interesante. Pero bueno, abrimos la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Quien tenga una pregunta lo puede hacer a través del chat o puede abrir su micrófono. Eliud.
Hola, muy bien, muy interesante, Francesco. Felicidades por la presentación.
Gracias.
Me queda una duda. Con base en tu experiencia, ¿cuánto tiempo llevaría toda esta arquitectura para financiar las pensiones, todos estos pilares para un país subdesarrollado como México o en general un país subdesarrollado? Porque veo que esto, pues, de la noche a la mañana no creo que se pueda hacer, salvo algún milagro, ¿no? Pero, ¿qué tiempo les llevó a los países, el caso de Suecia que comentabas, etcétera? ¿Qué tiempo se requiere para toda esta arquitectura, para este tipo de, para las pensiones? Gracias.
Gracias. Bueno, por supuesto, ¿qué hago? ¿Contesto en español o en inglés?
Like you want.
Ok. Bueno, contesto en inglés a lo mejor para que si está registrado luego la gente. Basically, your question is how long it takes to make this kind of reforms. Okay. It is, of course, it takes a long time. Now, also like Lourdes said, the thing is that European member states should, especially those which are still relying on pay-as-you-go systems, because I made these examples of some Central European countries, Sweden and Finland and so on. But basically, the big problem is that we have the same problem here in Europe, is that we are still relying too much on pay-as-you-go. So the question can be from you. You are asking Jose, how much does it take? But for us as well. I mean, today I was like I said, I'm in Rome, and sometimes I talk to some politicians here and say, listen, we cannot continue only with the first pillar and keep pension funds only voluntary, because our demographics will destroy our pension system. So I don't, of course, know how long it takes. For sure, I know that we should start as soon as possible, considering also, which is something I don't know if you are familiar with the Aaron theory, Aaron theorem. Pay-as-you-go or funded is quite, in principle, there is no a better or a worse system. It depends a lot on demographic, it depends a lot on the economic growth, and the number of people who are contributing and so on. In Europe, for sure, with the pay-as-you-go, we are condemned. We cannot continue with this. So if we come back to your question, Jose, Sweden and Denmark, but also Finland, somehow Netherlands, I didn't explain because it was not part of this discussion, but it's very important. They made funded pensions, call them first pillar bis like Sweden or in Denmark, or they can call them second pillar like they do in the Netherlands, but they made them mandatory. So the real, in my opinion, solution is the diversification. I'm not sure that only the funded would be the best, to be honest, because I see, for example, a lot of solidarity in America. When I speak about solidarity in North America, it is considered like a dangerous communism, but actually it is not. Solidarity is important in a civil society. Okay, solidarity is more about in pay-as-you-go. It's more feasible, the solidarity, but at the same time, so to have a mixed system is the best. The best pension systems actually in the world, even if you look at the Melbourne-Mercer classification, they have one common denominator. They are mixed. They have pay-as-you-go parts and the funded parts. So, of course, as it is something which goes over 30, 40 years, and I conclude this answer, Jose, to introduce a mixed system, you need many years. But for sure, for example, you can start gradually with new generations. You cannot change a system for people who are close to their pension retirement age, but for sure you can start gradually with new generations.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Francesco.
You're welcome.
Anybody else would like to comment or ask a few questions?
I have one, if I may.
Yes.
Okay. So in the countries where you have transfer of workers from one country to another in the pay-as-you-go structure, do the countries transfer the liability from one to the other, or do they guarantee, or how do they account for the number of years that a worker worked for France, for example, and then he goes to Germany, or how do they make to transfer this liability? One of the big issues of this type of pension.
It's a very good question, Alberto. So for the pay-as-you-go, it was very easy, because in the reparto pay-as-you-go, you didn't have assets. You didn't have any assets, because reparto, by definition, doesn't have assets. Reparto immediately pays the money which he receives to the current pensioners. So the European regulation that I mentioned, which is the regulation on the coordination of social security systems, basically describes the way how to calculate this. And the system is pro quota. So you stay, say, 7 years working in Germany. You, according to the German calculations, it's a nominal calculation because we are not talking about assets. We are talking about how much you contributed and how much you will then get from those contributions. Okay, so let's say Germany says, okay, I will have to pay to this worker, let's say out of 25 years, I will have to pay 7 years. So they make an average, a pro quota for the years passed in Germany. Then you move to Belgium and you stay 10 years in Belgium. And then you move again to another country, let's say. So at the end of your career, you decide to retire in Portugal or Spain because the weather is good. You will receive from every European country where you worked a part pro quota, so calculated on the ratio of the years you worked there from their country, for these countries, for the social security. Now, the problem is, like you said, that in some countries, I made the example now, there are also funded first pillar. So it's not anymore pay as you go, because in some countries that I mentioned, like Denmark, Sweden, Slovakia, and so on, there are also funded parts. So these funded parts are not, to answer your question, they are not transferred. They are not transferred. They remain in the country of where you worked, and only at the end of your working period, so when you reach the retirement age, those pension companies will pay you the part that the capitals that you accrued, but they don't make any transfer. We don't have transferability of money we don't have portability, basically.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. But the way there is also a big discussion about this, because the European Union would like to introduce portability of assets, but member states refuse. It's not only for the first pillar BIS pensions, it's also for the second pillar. Also for the second pillar, there is no portability. So every time you change a country, your money remains in the country of origin, let's say, and then you will get this money only when you reach the retirement age.
Thank you.
Welcome.
You made a wonderful presentation and completely in the framework that we were expecting, Francesco. Really, thank you very much for that. When we had the first session 1 month ago, we told them that there is such a diversity and so many opportunities that actuaries, lawyers, and financial people, they can just open their imagination and get of what the experiencers are going around the world and build their own proposals. So this is the second conference that we have. We're going to have a series of 5 conferences. And I hope that with the elements that you just provided, with such a diversity, so clear and so rich, in the Mexican students, they will have additional information to try to start building a Mexican model, which is actually really Mexican, because I think when we spoke of Francesco, we mentioned that in a way, Mexico has all the eggs in one basket. They had a previous system, they have a new system, but it's only savings for the moment. But I think it would be much more efficient to have something mixed, as you just mentioned, something public and private, something with solidarity, something with funding and individual commitment. And so instead of putting in competition one to each other, being complementary. And Mexico, it's a very large country with 32 federal units. And I think coordination among the states, among the federation, among the private pension funds would be paramount. So I don't have any question, Francesco, just really wanted to thank you very much for such a clear presentation.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I totally agree on what you said about Mexico. I hope you will take this direction, because I really think it's the best, a mixed system. Okay, thank you again to everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and let's keep in touch. Anyway, you can, Alejandro, you can give my email to the students if they need anything.
Okay, well,
Thank you very much as well,
Thank you,
Francesco, and have a good day.
Thank you. Buenas
thank you.
noches.
Good night.
Very much.
Para-
Good
Buenas
night
noches,
for
chao,
you. Yes.
Francisco. Thank you.
Hasta
Bye bye.
luego, gracias.
Hasta luego.